Coming up on this week's episode of The Right Side, terrorism comes to Edmonton and we have full coverage. Also, the BC NDP bring up electoral reform, and an Alberta NDP MLA leaves caucus. Jagmeet Singh wins the federal NDP leadership race, Energy East is dead, and Ottawa spends too much on legal fees. Finally, the BBC notes our Holocaust Memorial's Jewish omission. This is The Right Side, episode 37, recorded Saturday, October 7th, 2017, a reflection on terrorism and policy. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for another episode of The Right Side. Patrick and myself are back once again.
Good to be back. A heck of a lot happened in the news this week, actually.
Yes.
Even more so than we normally have, I think.
It practically started a couple hours after we finished producing the last episode, but more on that in just a couple moments. But, of course, before we begin, Right Side is a podcast where we cut through bias and sensationalism in the mainstream media and, of course, what certain politicians are saying or not saying, as well as just providing news and context to kind of provide that area of expertise on the news that you might not hear in the mainstream media, or they might just gloss over every so often. So we got a lot to talk about this week, and this week was really unprecedented for news. By the time 24 hours arrived after the last episode of Right Side was published, we had enough content for a full-on episode of The Right Side. So what we have elected to do this week is put together what we're calling a mega episode of The Right Side. We're going to be doing double the amount of content that we are normally doing. So that means we're going to be doing 2 Alberta stories, 2 BC stories, and 2 Canada stories, as well as 1 firing line. So we do have a lot of news to talk about, and that's what we want to do this week. We're not going to make a habit of it unless, of course, the news week necessitates it. But I think the 30 to 40 minute time frame that we normally aim for is a pretty good amount of time for one of these podcasts. But we are going to go longer this week just because there is all that news to talk about.
It was really interesting because normally the news cycle will start on a Monday, right? And we'll finish the news cycle, we'll do our show, and then that's it for the week basically. And nothing generally happens on the weekend. But this past weekend we had a really big story that happened just after we'd finished. And I believe you were going to start with that.
Yeah, just hours after we finished production on Right Side 36, we were made aware of the horrible news that a police officer was struck by a speeding car in downtown Edmonton. The officer struck was Constable Mike Chernick, who is a veteran of the Edmonton Police Service. Chernick fought his attacker off after being stabbed and protecting his gun, because what had happened there is the vehicle hit his police car and also hit him, and then following this, the driver of that car got out and started stabbing him. Chernick is expected to make a full recovery and was honored at the Edmonton Oilers season opener earlier this week. Later, the attacker was stopped at an Edmonton police check stop in a U-Haul van. This was later that evening, a couple hours after that. A pursuit then ensued, running through the downtown core of Edmonton, and as the pursuit went on, the attacker in the U-Haul van deliberately tried to hit pedestrians on the street. He hit 4 pedestrians, some of which are still in hospital under critical condition. The attacker was arrested after his vehicle was stopped by the Edmonton Police Tactical Units, and this, of course, marks the first terrorist attack in Western Canada. CTV News first reported that evening that an ISIS flag was spotted in the vehicle that was a part of the attack, and there was lots of discussion amongst other media, global, CBC, and specifically online about whether or not the flag that was seen was actually an ISIS flag, and that dominated speculation in the early hours of this incident. Lots of people doubting that it was, but Edmonton Police Chief Rod Connect did confirm that evening that it was an ISIS flag, and later on that following Sunday we got more information about the attacks, and this pretty much solidified the motives that this was a terrorist attack. And there were also numerous questions towards the Edmonton police, even on Sunday, if this confirmation that it was an ISIS flag by the media was actually indeed an ISIS flag. They're going for the double confirmation on that, I guess. Also, there were questions from, I believe, I'm not sure what news outlet it was, but there was some question from one of the news outlets who was asking, why is the initial thoughts about this attack being conceived as terrorism, even though all the evidence had already been presented to the media the night before. So as we see here, this was clearly an act of radical Islamic terrorism. The police confirmed it. The RCMP is investigating it as a terrorist attack. We'll ultimately have more details on the warning signs and actions of the attacker as we progress through the story, but it's at this point that this story takes an even more disturbing turn. So on Sunday, we learned that the attacker was a Somalian refugee who came to Canada, and this same person actually arrived in the United States, believe it or not, in 2011. And in 2011, he was ordered to be deported back to Somalia by an American immigration judge. U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, otherwise known as ICE, said that the attacker was transferred into custody at San Diego's Otay Mesa Detention Center on July 15th, 2011. And after this, he was taken to that department by U.S. Customs and Border Protection. So if someone is taken there by Customs and Border Protection, that normally means that flags were set off at the border when he attempted to cross into the U.S., or he crossed into the U.S. illegally and was apprehended. 2 months after this, at his deportation hearing, he was ordered back to Somalia, but he didn't go back. On November 23rd, 2011, he was released due to, quote, a lack of likelihood of his removal in the reasonably foreseeable future. This meant, of course, that the attacker was free in the U.S. He was supposed to report to ICE's enforcement and removal operations on his own in January 2012, but did not. U.S. sources said he had no criminal record, but at the same time, we were also told that he was lacking any kind of identification on him when he arrived in the U.S., and this is further evidenced by the fact he was given the birth date of January 1st, 1987. So now this is the point in the story where we ask, how did he get to Canada? Well, in 2012, he came to Canada as a Somalian refugee. He entered Canada through an official port of entry, declared asylum, and then was granted refugee status later that year. Kind of a little bit different than what we've been talking about in the past regarding people illegally crossing into Canada this year and declaring asylum and hoping for refugee status. This guy actually went through the official channels in order to do that. The immigration minister at the time was Jason Kenney of the former Conservative government. Today, Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale repeatedly insisted that our screening was, quote, thorough. So it was obviously not thorough enough to catch the signs that, one person who was coming in and declared refugee status could eventually become radicalized. And that's a discussion that we should probably have at some point, we being the people of Canada. Upon further investigation by CBC, it's also been revealed that a former co-worker of his realized that the attacker was an ISIS supporter years before the attack and advocated, quote, genocidal beliefs. The co-worker then provided this detailed account to CBC. It was very incoherent. He was just bounced from idea to idea, tangent to tangent, just about what he believed, and he definitely had genocidal beliefs, you could say. He had major issues with polytheists. He said they needed to die, that sort of thing. I only had a handful of conversations with him about it. Those occurred when there were just the two of us in the workroom. His co-worker then reported the attacker to the Edmonton Police Service, who passed the case on to the RCMP. The attacker was interviewed by the RCMP in Edmonton, but given the nature of the threats that were being examined, there was not enough evidence at the time to arrest him. This will obviously raise some questions in the future about what we need to do to both secure our borders and immigration system, as well as combating radicalization in our own communities. The Trudeau government must also be commended for calling this attack a terrorist attack from the very beginning. Andrew Scheer, the Conservative opposition leader, released a statement condemning the attacks and putting the focus on the victims and the family. Both leaders have wisely left the discussion of anti-terror policy and immigration reform to another date. But let it be known that when the time arrives for such a discussion, we need to be able to have that discussion, candidly, whether that's in Ottawa or just as Canadians. And people need to be able to talk about this without the term racist being thrown around. Because, as I'm sure we all know, if this comes up in Ottawa and someone wants to advocate tighter border controls, they are going to get called racist by a member of the opposition or the media. With that being said, Jagmeet Singh, the new NDP leader, which we'll talk about in just a little bit of spoilers there for this podcast. This week he issued a tweet saying, "My thoughts are with the injured and all those impacted by the violence in Edmonton. Grateful for the courage of first responders." So what did Jagmeet Singh miss there?
It seems like there's a certain word that starts with T and ends with terrorism that he kind of forgot about there, yes?
Exactly.
He mentioned violence in Edmonton, but he didn't mention terrorism.
Yeah. So as you can see, that kind of idea is taking place. And this also manifested itself in Justin Trudeau, because hours after the attack on Sunday, he went back to his campaign roots. On Sunday, he shared a post on Facebook from former Democratic Reform Minister Maryam Monsef that featured an image saying, "Love lives here, and white supremacy." The text of the post said, "Well said, Minister. Canadians' resolve has been tested this weekend, but I know as always we will come through united. Our diversity is our strength." And what's truly bizarre about this is that Monsef's post initially had nothing to do with the Edmonton attack, yet Trudeau decided to link a post by one of his ministers and caucus members saying, "End white supremacy," to the terror attack in Edmonton.
Which is curious because it had nothing to do with white supremacy in the first place.
Exactly.
And I believe that the words white supremacy, it didn't even come about because of this. It's almost as if he was trying to link it to the Las Vegas shootings that, of course, happened.
That happened that evening, I believe.
That happened that evening. So it's almost like he was trying to link it to that instead, because the shooter there ended up being a white male. And then I noticed on Facebook that evening that a lot of the white supremacy talk was flowing out of people really curiously. But I think when it comes to this Edmonton one, I think what we should be interested in is noting the previous episode's firing line story, in which I was talking about a guy who was accused. Hours before this, I was talking about how he was, accused of terrorism. He was acquitted, and he had all of these crazy posts on his Facebook advocating for almost like targets of sites around the country that could be used for a terror attack. And then just hours after, this similar thing happened. And I think I had mentioned at that time that we need to be careful with this sort of thing, because it could happen to us. Yeah. And just hours later, it did happen to us.
It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, given the current climate in the world, unfortunately. And, that needs to be a part of the discussion that people are going to have one day. And, I think it's good to skip the stage where we start talking about potential reactions to this as the attack is just winding down, and leave that for a different date. But when that comes around, we do need to remember this attack.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to be very interesting to see if anything changes from this. I think it's clear at this point that the RCMP and Public Safety Canada do need to do something with the refugee program, and specifically in terms of perhaps keeping better tabs on the refugees, because this guy was a government-sponsored refugee for 1 year. And,
Mhm.
over the number of times, there should be some way to check up in on the kind of process or progress that was being made. And you got to ask yourself this question as well. If this person is being held by ICE in the US and the US doesn't want him and the US actually wanted to deport him to Somalia, should we really be bringing that in as a refugee?
It's a good question. I mean, clearly they had some sort of reason to want to deny him. I think that's something that should be taken into consideration. Of course, uh, when it comes to government action, I think Canadian governments should be taking their own action on something, but they should definitely take the opinions of our allies into consideration. But in a sense, Canada is a sovereign country, and it should be
Exactly.
making its own decisions on
Yeah.
someone. But they have to be careful and measured decisions that are to the benefit of Canadians.
Right. So, and a lot of the points we touched on here were kind of mentioned once and then glossed over in the media. You hear about this attack everywhere in Canada, but what we wanted to do with this story was specifically focus in on the points of interest that didn't exactly get too much coverage in the media or were glossed over and kind of just mentioned once in news reporting or mentioned online and not really talked about on the television news. And that was our focus here on this coverage. But we will be watching this and seeing if there's any kind of major revelations that come from this for our refugee and immigration systems going forward. So,
Mm-hmm.
all right. So BC, the NDP has been up to things in BC.
They certainly have. And 2 weeks ago, I talked about how the BC government's solution to banning corporate and union donations was to get the taxpayers to directly subsidize political parties through taxes. And now it appears that they're moving quickly on the other two major policy goals that they had promised when they took power this past summer. And that is, of course, opposing the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, and something that kind of cropped up later this week that kind of flew in under the radar, and that was an electoral reform referendum on proportional representation. So this week, let's talk about the electoral reform. Legislation was introduced on Wednesday that will have some voters submit their referendum ballot by mail, and the ballots will be sent out in fall 2018 for a vote completed before the end of November, so just over a year from now. Approval for a change will need 50% plus one vote province-wide, and if the referendum passes, the new system would be enacted before the next provincial election, which is scheduled for 2021. In the meantime, Attorney General David Eby says that the government hopes to engage voters with debate and discussion about the potential change to how they elect MLAs. He said, quote, "All British Columbians will be encouraged to engage in this process." This was from a release from Eby's office. All feedback received through the engagement process will be summarized and put in a report that will include a recommendation of suggested questions for the referendum ballot. So the CBC News article that was covering this story mentioned all of this and all that's happening with the referendum, but it doesn't actually mention why it's happening, and it doesn't really connect any dots. And I think that's something that's very important about this, because the why actually makes the NDP and the Green Party look kind of bad. So it mentions that during the election campaign, the NDP promised to hold a referendum on electoral reform. It said that the current system, quote, "gives all the power to make decisions to a party that doesn't even get 50% of the votes." So that's kind of interesting, because it's kind of like how the NDP are now making a major decision when they themselves not only did not get 50% of the votes, but also weren't even the party with the most votes. And the Greens also campaigned on a promise to introduce a system of proportional representation. Party leader Andrew Weaver said that the exact form of electoral change would be a matter of negotiation. It appears that the negotiation was what led to the Green agreement to support the NDP minority government in exchange for a concession on a few major policy platforms, electoral reform to benefit them being one of them. And on Wednesday, the province also introduced legislation to amend the Constitution Act to reduce the number of seats required for recognized party political party status from 4 to 2. So this is also curiously to the benefit of the Greens, as they have 3 seats. It would allow them to hold official party status, which allows them more funding, greater speaking opportunities in the legislature, and a bunch of other different things too that will help them. And the legislation will also change the fixed election date from Saturday in October to Tuesday in May. Ebby says that the change will allow for a January budget to be debated and then passed. So back in 2005, 57% of people voted in favor of a single transferable vote system of proportional representation, which fell short of the 60% threshold established by then Premier Gordon Campbell. It also failed to have the voter turnout that the requirements needed. And 4 years later, in 2009, voters were also asked to vote on electoral reform, but the provincial government actually campaigned against the proposal, even though they had promised to put it in anyways. So the initiative actually only received 39% of the vote. And personally, I think that was because more people actually understood what the proposal was about, whereas back in 2005 it was kind of new.
Right.
And
STV
since people were able
confusing.
to know more about it, it kind of flew by the wayside 4 years later. Now, STV, single transferable vote, it's a very interesting system in which that you get one vote on a political party, and then if they don't win, you are able to transfer your vote to a second choice. And this is something that would have benefited the NDP and the Greens quite heavily, because they would both be the second choice of each other. Or each other's supporters, that is. So it was very interesting how the Liberals actually put this proposal in for proportional representation, and then after the second time it failed to get even 40%, they decided not to do it at all. So Ebby says that regardless of the referendum results, any election that's called before July 1st, 2021 would be conducted using the current first-past-the-post system. So if the minority government does happen to fall before then, that means it will be under first past the post.
I also think that's a convenient out for the NDP, because you got to remember that the NDP and Liberals are the two big parties in BC, and it's not a situation in BC where minority governments are all that common. I think the last one was in the 1950s prior to this one?
Indeed, because it's a very, very much a two-party system. Almost.
So this could be very well also be an out for the NDP if they decide that we don't like the idea of electoral reform. Let's just call an election before 2021, win a majority, and scrap this idea. Another alarming issue with this is that it only requires 50% of the people to vote yes to change this system, which, I mean, if you're voting for what in effect also feels like a blind change, because you don't know what kind of proportional system is it going to be. Is it going to be is it going to be a system where the people get to choose the MLAs that sit as a result of the proportion received by the party? Is it going to be a list system where the party gets to choose what MPs stand, and then the people just choose a party, and then that party gets that percentage of the votes? Or is it going to be a mixed member system, kind of like the way New Zealand does, where you get a vote for party and a vote for local representative, and then those two are reconciled, and everyone gets the amount of percent seats that they win, but also gives precedence to people to choose their own representative locally. And it just seems a little bit odd to pursue a referendum and outline the fact that we're going to have a 50% threshold for this, we're going to do this, and we're not going to tell you guys right now off the beginning of what this is going to look like before we announce the referendum. That just seems a little bit odd for something that deals with democracy, and as we all know, democracy is very important.
Yeah, and it's not just odd. I would even call it shady, is in they're not telling us what position that they want to take on it. They're trying to leave it up to constituents to say, oh, well, we want your feedback. What do you guys want? We'll do it. We'll do whatever it is. But they didn't actually mention anything about a voter turnout threshold either. So there could be only 3 people that vote, and as long as they get 2 people that vote, the whole system gets changed. So they might not publicize this whatsoever
Could all be in the
in an
fine print.
effect to get low voter turnout, and then just get their supporters to go vote. And that could be the way that they do this, if it is indeed what they want. Now I'm probably fairly certain that they put this through because the Green Party wanted them to, and of course, the NDP having their minority government is dependent on the Green Party
A
supporting
strong,
them.
stable
So,
minority, I believe he called it.
yes, yes, that's what Mr. Weaver called a strong, stable minority government. Of course, it's very dependent on his good graces to continue going. So we'll have to see how this unfolds going forward. It's very much in the early stages, and we'll have probably more as more news comes out about it, and as the consultation process goes through.
Yes, very important to keep watch on democracy. And we're going to do that with our next Alberta story. And this is a story that you would think that would have gained media attention in Alberta this week. It was on the radio a bit in Calgary and in the print papers, but nowhere on the TV. So the headline is, Karen McPherson leaves NDP caucus. Calgary McKay Nose Hill MLA Karen McPherson has left the NDP caucus to sit as an independent. She posted a statement on her Facebook page where she said, Alberta, in fact, the world, is changing quickly, and I believe our political processes need to reflect these shifts. Continuing to do politics the way it's being done will lead to further polarization. She then further goes on to say that health care and education are the two largest items in the provincial budget, and while they're being adequately managed, they need to be transformed. Our economy is slowly recovering from a revenue collapse, leaving deficits that Albertans deem unacceptable, and there's no clear path to alleviating the deficit. So if you look at the exact words she wrote, that is ultimately a very clear swipe at the NDP policy that they are pursuing. But of course, she doesn't mention the NDP government by name. She also says, quote, there's a vibrant and burgeoning startup culture growing in Calgary and across Alberta. It needs nurturing and support, and it will help lead the way for our economy. And now if you look at this is talking about small businesses, startups, and probably high tech. And this is a complete 180-degree departure as for what's seen and perceived as is the current NDP government policy. Also, this is the biggest step away from the NDP that we've seen for any MLA since the 2015 election. We've had a few NDP MLAs that were removed from their caucus but later reinstated, but there have been no outright floor crossings or departures from the party until McPherson. In fact, there was a floor crossing last year from the Progressive Conservatives to the NDP in Calgary MLA Sandra Jensen. McPherson was elected in 2015 as a part of the NDP wave, and Calgary McKay Nose Hill was created for the 2012 election, and before that was part of the Calgary McKay riding, which was the seat for former PC cabinet minister Gary Marr. Prior to the NDP taking this seat, it was a progressive conservative stronghold. So one can only wonder at this time if McPherson will later join the Alberta Party or the Alberta Liberals, if either of those parties can be organized to create a new center in Alberta politics. We've also discussed before that both the Alberta Party and Alberta Liberals poll somewhere between 5 and 8% support. There seems to be little interest in merging the center parties in Alberta, although it's entirely possible that McPherson could continue to sit as an independent until next election and run against her opponents. Though 2019 is a long time away, independent floor crossers don't normally fare well in re-election unless they have a deep connection to their constituents. And there's one final note on this. This story was covered on News Talk 770 in Calgary, but wasn't covered on the evening newscasts in Edmonton or Calgary. It was covered in the papers and editorial segments, and when you read McPherson's statement, it doesn't outright cite the NDP policies as the reason for the floor crossing, but upon analysis, there's clear issues that are being raised here related to the NDP government program. So she's no Derek Fildebrandt in that she's being expelled from the caucus or deciding to leave on her own, but still having the views of her party. So it was very interesting to not hear too much about this in the provincial media this week, though we were a little bit busy talking about terrorism and whatnot. But I think it's a big deal anytime someone leaves the governing party in a legislature to sit as an independent.
Yeah, I think so, especially if it's from the ruling party as well, because it means that they're shifting away from government. If they was from an opposition to an independent, I could understand that, but it's quite a change.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I mean, you just have to look at the history of these Calgary ridings, right? They have been progressive conservative since the 1970s. There have been a few liberal blips here and there in the center of Calgary and on the northeast end, but they have all pretty much been progressive conservative since the 1970s, and social credit before that. So you kind of got to wonder if they see the writing on the wall for 2019. And we'll just have to wait and see what happens with that. But it'd be interesting to see if McPherson ends up joining the Alberta Party or the Alberta Liberals on this. So, all right. So that's it for Alberta this week, and huge shocker on Sunday. After the
Yeah, on
terrorist
Sunday.
attack.
This was the other reason why we almost had a full docket just shortly after completing the last episode, and that was because the federal NDP leadership election was held this past Sunday. And, well, we now have a new leader of the federal NDP, and unlike the Conservative race last May, it only took one ballot to find out who would win. And if you listened to the media this past week, you'd probably the only things you'd know about the new leader is that he's East Indian, he's a practicing Sikh. He's not in Parliament at the moment, but he will run for the MP in the 2019 election, and in the meantime, he'll travel across Canada to meet with Canadians and build the NDP brand. He's likable, he's very well spoken, and he's 7 years younger than Trudeau. Of course, the new CBC leader, Andrew Scheer, is 5 months younger than Singh, but the media tends to forget about him, of course. So because of the media's Because of the media's coverage of Jagmeet Singh, who won on the first ballot with a staggering 54% of over Charlie Angus, Nikki Ashton, and Guy Caron, it's not really surprising that not many people know who he is. A new Angus Reid poll showed that about one-third of respondents said they hadn't heard of him before, while 36% said they knew his name but nothing else about him. It's almost as if by design that Singh's policies are unknown to the majority of Canadians. And that's because while focusing on Singh's religion and his fresh-faced appearance, beard notwithstanding, the media is forgetting about his policies. And for a quick refresher, I invite you all to revisit the Right Side episode 29 from 2 months ago, when we profiled each candidate and outlined their policies on how they would shape Canada if they won the election. So since Singh's triumph, I feel it's necessary to revisit some of the more salient points from that episode, as the mainstream media clearly won't talk about what he wants to do. Singh's policies are based around a drastic shift in taxation, environmental policy, and social justice, and most of his efforts are being put into climate change and the environment. And even since his victory, his policy website still reads like it was designed by a lawyer, with some translation to put it into everyday English. Of course, some highlights include phasing out the coal industry, retraining coal industry workers into greener industries, a zero-emission vehicle strategy to increase affordability and availability of electric cars by taxing high-emission vehicle owners and companies, and he wants to also cancel all subsidies to natural resource companies and to use tax incentives and rebates on goods, services, and investments to help us collectively meet our climate goals, as well as implementing a carbon tax. He also pledges a Canadians with Disabilities Guarantee, which would provide those living with disabilities with a non-taxable living income. So Singh also wants to combine old age security into other seniors' benefits, which would actually end up lowering the amount of money that seniors would get from old age security. And he also wants to increase the taxable benefit for low-income full-time workers, which would basically do the same thing as increasing the minimum wage. Singh also wants to cancel unpaid internships and make temp workers into permanent workers after 6 months. So this would really impact tourism, agriculture, and other temp-based industries dramatically, and raise prices on those on the products created by those industries, such as hotels, fruits and vegetables, grains, anything to do with food, and a lot of other places across the country. He also wants to create a $15 per hour minimum wage for federal employees, and he wants to have it keep pace with inflation. And he also wants to introduce new high income tax brackets, and he also wants to increase the capital gains tax from 50% to 75%, and he wants to add to the estate tax on assets. And he also wants to reverse corporate tax cuts the last 20 years and increase the corporate income tax to 19.5% from 15%. And he also advocated back in the July debate about income redistribution. He said that people have wealth and they need to transfer that wealth to those living in poverty now. He feels that wealth transfers are different than social programs and should play a place in Canada. So, based on all this, we can tell that Singh's policies would change the economy of Canada and impact how companies would do business in Canada. And what the media is really missing in their coverage could have a major impact in the next election when people go to the polls, thinking only about Singh's charming demeanor and his sharp fashion skills as a better alternative to Trudeau, while not knowing about what the NDP actually want to accomplish in Parliament if they won the election.
And that is 100% good question to ask, because as we talked about on that episode, it is not out of the realm of possibility in Canada or any kind of parliamentary democracy for the third party to become government. We've seen it lots of places. We've seen it in Alberta. So, and that there definitely needs to be more discussion on policy rather than the fact that Singh is a Sikh. And, there was even another story that ran this week after Singh was elected. Headline being 7 in 10 Canadians would be A-OK with voting for a party led by a Sikh. And then they also highlight that, this would also actually cause problems for the NDP in Quebec. So, lots of focus on race and religion here, but we'll just have to wait and see what happens with that. And it's doing everyone a disservice.
Yeah, it's really interesting how the media is focusing on the race and religion when, as a parliamentarian, race and religion really doesn't hold that much stock in the House of Commons itself. Everyone has a chance to speak, and everyone has a chance to raise their opinions on a certain issue. And what's interesting is that it's really what comes down to what he believes in and what his policies are.
Yep.
And that's what's going to determine where the NDP is going to go, not what he wears on his head or what he wears on his belt or whether he has a beard or what he looks like or what race he is. None of that really matters when it comes to politics, because all that really matters is what you believe in, not what kind of God you believe in, rather, but what policies you believe in. And that's what's going to determine what's going to happen.
Yeah, 47% of people polled in Quebec said that they would not vote for such a person, regardless of his policies, and that's the highest among Canada.
Mm-hmm.
So, we're gonna have to wait and see on this. And another issue being made is he doesn't have a seat in Parliament, but I mean, that's happened before as well. It's all got to be about policy at this point, and by not talking about that, they continue to do a disservice. And they also seem to be asking him questions that are tough too. He got stumped by one of the questions following his victory speech, and there was discussion about that as well in the media. And you got to ask yourself, would you see that same kind of thing if Trudeau got stumped by a question, right? So.
And we see that on a regular basis. Trudeau gets stumped by questions quite frequently in the House of Commons every single time they meet. And we don't really hear about it that much unless you're actually watching the House of Commons question period. But he stumbles over his words all the time, whereas Singh, they almost blasted him for it for some reason.
Exactly.
But it wasn't even that big of a stumble.
He
just kind of took a bit more time to think about the question, and he wanted to carefully answer it to make sure that his words reflected what he actually thought. And I think that's actually less of a stumble and more of a good thing, really, because it means that they're thinking before they're speaking, which is something that politicians don't always do.
Yeah, true. Alrighty. Well, we'll have to watch Singh and see what he does with his new position and how he's able to articulate his points into the fall session without having a seat. But before that, we have another Canada story, and this one was a shocker when it came out on Thursday, I believe it was, and that is that TransCanada has terminated their plan for the Energy East pipeline. So estimates say that this project was worth $15.7 billion, and getting out of it will cost TransCanada $1 billion. So while on the surface it might seem as though TransCanada felt that, maybe the pipeline wasn't needed due to lower energy demand, or may not have the capacity to fulfill Energy East, or maybe they just want to focus on Keystone XL, because they're the company that also is building Keystone in the U.S., that is not the case. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of Energy East, let's just explain what was being approved and what won't happen. So a huge portion of the Energy East pipeline already exists from the Alberta-Saskatchewan border through Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec, with branches down to the United States in Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec. What was being approved was an expansion from Hardisty, Alberta to the Saskatchewan border, and an expansion from Montreal through Quebec to refineries in New Brunswick. So while some may brush this off as, or may brush the cancellation of Energy East off as a simple business decision and not a decision related to the economic and regulatory climate in Canada, all one really needs to do is look at TransCanada's recent actions. Last month, the corporation sought a 30-day suspension period for the project's applications for more time to review environmental assessment factors. Back in August, the National Energy Board, the NEB, which we've talked about before, allowed the inclusion of upstream and downstream greenhouse gas emissions from increased production and consumption of oil resulting from future projects. This means that the environmental impact of not only construction, but the extraction, production, consumption, and other things of the product will need to be considered when looking at whether or not a pipeline project is good for Canada. It's these extra regulations that were put on by the government overseeing NEB that contributed to the death of the pipeline. The NEB has been on a constant course of expansion this year, with even attempts to move the NEB head office from Calgary to Ottawa, which we discussed early on the right side. We need to be 100% realistic here and look at where our fuel products come from. We import gasoline from the US, from Venezuela, from the Middle East, and any person with the basics of cognitive reasonings can ask themselves, would these countries really reduce their competitive effectiveness on the world stage at the expense of emissions in Canada? Probably not. It's not to say we should be careless with the environment, but regulators and the government in Canada must be mindful that we live in a global economy, and if we want the businesses, the large businesses, and the energy companies in particular to be competitive, we need to fight on a level playing field with those countries. Iran, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela don't necessarily care about the carbon emissions, nor do they care about theirs. This means that we must be mindful when we are looking for our competitive edge. Rachel Notley, Alberta's premier, issued a statement on Thursday morning saying that her government was, quote, deeply disappointed by the recent decision from TransCanada. She further expanded on this by saying, our government has supported Energy East since the project was proposed. We believe this nation-building project would have benefited all of Canada through new jobs, investment, energy security, and the ability to displace oil being imported into Canada from overseas and the United States. And with this, it was estimated that in addition to the revenue brought into Canada, Energy East would create 14,000 full-time jobs yearly. So when you have the NDP premier of Alberta saying that we need to displace oil imported from somewhere else, I think people are onto something. Jason Kenney, who's running for the leadership of the United Conservative Party in Alberta, said that the province should hold a referendum asking for a fair discussion on equalization if the regulatory regimes put in place in Ottawa continues to be hostile to Alberta energy. This referendum would then force the federal government to renegotiate the equalization formula, ensuring that Alberta doesn't have to send as much money eastward, given that provinces like Quebec are hostile to energy products. And basically what a negotiation on this level would do would basically say that the net benefits from energy development and extraction should not be considered when looking at equalization. You can look at what the province sells in terms of raw energy, but don't look at the huge net benefits that pipelines provide, and that would be a good negotiating standpoint. And now, as with all our other stories here at the right side, this is where this story takes a rather bizarre turn. Montreal Mayor Dennis Coderre didn't waste any time claiming victory. He said, quote, "I've been saying since day one that TransCanada was arrogant and condescending. It's an enormous victory." So keep in mind here that natural resources and energy are a federal jurisdiction. Provinces gain from resource revenue and can develop their own natural resources. Municipal governments have zero sway in national energy products. If anything, in this case, Dennis Coderre is the one who is arrogant and condescending. First and foremost, it's because Dennis Coderre himself is using pipelines to dump raw sewage from Montreal into the St. Lawrence River. So while he's preaching about keeping emissions low in Alberta from the oil sands and from the pipelines, he's dumping raw sewage into his river. Secondly, Coderre and politicians in Quebec should be activists for pipeline construction. Oil by pipeline is much safer than oil by rail. And it was only a couple of days ago that the trial for the Lac-Mégantic disaster began. And also on this note, when it comes to safety of oil by rail, there was a derailment on Friday in southern Alberta. 6 rail cars carrying oil derailed near Colehurst. So in many ways, Dennis Coderre was the front face on the Anti-Energy East campaign. And as far back as January 2016, he was leading a coalition to represent 80 cities and towns in Quebec. So, well, it looks like we're looking primarily at a Quebec issue here in the Quebec versus Alberta side of it and the Quebec politicians. You also need to look at the market. And some say it all comes down to the price of oil, but that's not true. You need to remember that the NDP in Alberta brought in a carbon tax that increased the price of doing business here in Alberta. Trudeau is also bringing in a carbon tax, and together both these taxes will increase over time and act as a cooling off factor for our natural resources economy. There's also the fact that Alberta has capped emissions of the oil sands at 100 megatons, which will be reached somewhere in the 2025 or 2027 range. And we've discussed this before here on the right side as well. Yet it's entirely possible that a company exploring a new project in 2017 to begin construction in the 2020s won't see a future for their project if they're only going to have a few years of useful life expectancy from it, if emissions are going to be capped come 2025 or 2027. So overall, there have been signals saying that the governments support pipelines in the words that they say, but their actions do not actually support energy development. And this can further be seen in that Alberta Premier Rachel Notley simply released a statement on this cancellation, while Jason Kenney actually had a televised press conference talking about this in Calgary. So now let's look at this a little bit differently and assume that this was Quebec. And we could actually do that because Quebec was in the news this week with Bombardier. And last week, the U.S. put a 220% tariff on Bombardier planes. And this was added to on Friday with another 80% duty on the C-Series jet from Bombardier. This brings the total tariff to about 300%. So it'll be interesting to see and watch in the coming days what the action of the Quebec government and federal government take will be in response to these tariffs. So the question to ask is, will the governments in Quebec and Ottawa move to get a Canadian product, airplanes in this case, to market? Or will they just accept the decision as they are doing with TransCanada and Energy East? Interesting change of perspective there, I think.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's really interesting how they're really fighting for Bombardier, which is, of course, based in Quebec, but they're not really fighting very much to keep Energy East going. And, of course, in BC, the BC government here has been trying to fight the Trans Mountain Pipeline project here, which, of course, the federal government approved. And they're trying to fight tooth and nail to stop the pipeline expansion here that would end up going through Burnaby to the coast, so that oil could get into markets that BC primarily trades with, such as the Asian markets and further along the west coast of the United States. So it's very interesting how there seems to be two very different factions in Canada when it comes to energy and when it comes to pipelines.
It's the old battle
And
lines from the 70s and 80s appearing.
exactly, and we'll have to see how this all turns out, but it almost seems that the infighting between these two factions will probably stop much of the investment that would happen from
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. And it's really a shame because you can look at other major projects like the Trans-Canada Highway, or even going all the way back to Confederation, the National Railway of John A. Macdonald that built a country. And
Hmm.
you got to ask, will there ever be the negotiation skills within all the various provinces and the federal government to actually get one of these things done? Because let's face facts here. You might have some carbon output from the extraction of the oil in Alberta, but you're not going to have emissions from the pipeline unless there is a leak in the pipeline. And it has been proven time and time again by independent research that tanker cars leak more than actual pipelines do. So it's really just a case of one side being super well funded here, and the governments actually most of the governments in Canada being friendly to that side. So,
Hmm.
anyways, what's this next story about legal fees?
All right, so my last story here is talking a bit about the federal government, and we haven't really actually been talking about the federal Liberal government very much this week. So this is going to be a bit of a doozy. It's almost a weird story, one of those stories you come across and say, huh, So the federal Liberal government has actually spent more than $110,000 between January 2016 and April 2017 fighting a First Nations girl in court to block payment for orthodontic treatment that would cost just $6,000. And this was according to documents released under the Access to Information Act and shared with CBC News. And the final cost will actually be even higher than that, as decision on this case was not handed down until May, and that appeals are ongoing and will be continued to be fought in court. So let's give you a bit of background to this. Josie Willier, who is a Cree teen living in Calgary, she's had ongoing problems with her teeth that result in chronic aching pain in her lower gums. She took over-the-counter pain medication daily for 2 years because of an extreme discomfort associated with impacted teeth and a severe overbite, among other ailments. So a Calgary-based orthodontist, Mark Antos, recommended braces to avoid invasive jaw surgery in the future. And of course, braces are something that are fairly common among teenagers to treat a tooth of space issues and other afflictions on that. I mean, I myself didn't have to have them, but a lot of my friends and a lot of my family members had to do that. So it's something that's not really uncommon. So Stacy Shiner, the child's mother, sought payment for the braces under the First Nations and Inuit Health Benefit Program, but ended up being denied by Health Canada, the department that administers the insurance plan. She appealed 3 times to no avail, and then actually took the case to federal court. So last fall, the Liberals voted to support an NDP motion that actually called on the government to stop fighting Indigenous families who are seeking access to services covered by Ottawa, but only 2 days after that vote, government lawyers were back in court fighting this case. So Willier is not actually the first child to be repeatedly denied coverage. In the 2015 to 2016, which is basically when the Liberals took power, nearly all applications at all 3 levels of appeals pertaining to the orthodontics program were denied by administrators of the benefits program. 99% of the first level, 100% of the second level, and 100% of all third level appeals were all denied. So once they say no to you, that's basically it. There's no appealing to it. So a statement Thursday, Health Canada defended this decision to deny care, adding that in 2014 to 15, it funded approximately $5 million in orthodontic treatment for other kids. Quote, in this case, the issue is not about the monetary value or the affordability of the claim, the statement said. The issue is that there's no clinical evidence to support approval of the claim under the non-insured health benefits program. So Health Canada also said the program for First Nations children is more generous than what is available to others. Quote, the NIHB program covers the full cost of orthodontic treatment when it is medically necessary, whereas private plans typically cover only 1/3 of all costs. So Cindy Blackstock, who is the executive director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society and an advocate for equal treatment of Indigenous children, was an intervener in Shiner's case. She said, I think it's atrocious. As a human being, I think it's immoral that Canada would not fund services where two concurring pediatric orthodontists agree that without the treatments, this girl will experience chronic pain and will have difficulty eating and talking. As a taxpayer, I'm absolutely floored that Canada would spend $110,000 defending against a $6,000 investment to help a child. They could have used that money to buy 18 children in medical need the orthodontic services they needed. Basically, this is another case where the Liberal government is spending money where they shouldn't be in fighting this case. The whole point of Canada's public health care system is to take care of people with maladies that threaten their quality of life and to support those who would not be able to pay for the treatment themselves. For them to pay such an exorbitant amount of taxpayer money in legal fees just to get out of an in comparison paltry amount, it's really ridiculous, isn't it? And the fact that it's treatment of being denied for a First Nations girl, when the Liberals are so smug in Parliament defending their Indigenous record against the previous Harper government, it's also really hypocritical of them, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, the key point here, $6,000 is what the procedure would cost, and $110,000 to defend that. At that point you should just ask why this is the case. Why has no one from the health ministry or the Indigenous Affairs ministry spoken up and done something and actually just put this case to bed before it got too far down the track? I mean, $6,000 isn't anything, and I'm sure there are rich politicians in Ottawa, and I'm sure if one of them wanted to, they could probably foot the entire bill for that procedure. So that would be an ultimate solution to this, and I think that would send a huge message if someone were to do that, and it would really also, like you said, underline the hypocrisy of this government, because how many times did we hear over the last number of years that this government is so focused on truth and reconciliation, but in this case they have a clear-cut case here to demonstrate that, but they're not. And also, last other point, they always like to slam the Harper government for that, and the media also did as well. But you really haven't heard a peep of this anywhere else, have we?
No, it just happened in that one CBC article that I found in their politics website, and I don't think it's been found anywhere else. I did a quick search and couldn't find any other publication that talked about it. So it's really interesting how this came about, and the fact that they're spending so much money to defend against something that's so little in comparison. It's like paying someone $1 so that they won't rob you of a penny. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it's a very good analogy there. Yeah. All right. So speaking of other things that weren't found in the mainstream media, so our firing line, it's become known for showcasing the most absurd antics of Canadian media, from the truth about Omar Khadr, refugee problems at West Edmonton Mall, and kayaks with a certain federal leader, the Prime Minister. This week we're going to take it one step further. So recently a new Holocaust memorial was opened up in Ottawa. It was commissioned by the former Harper government and was inaugurated by Justin Trudeau on September 27th. The National Holocaust Monument, as it's called, quote, commemorates the millions of men, women, and children murdered during the Holocaust and honors the survivors who persevered and were able to make their way to Canada after one of the darkest chapters in history. There was no mention of the word Jew or Jewish, and, this might seem as though it's being a bit blown out of proportion, but on September 27th, it was covered in the national media in Canada that the government was going to apologize for refusing entry to Jewish refugees in 1939 from Germany. The media also had zero coverage of this omission, not on Global, CTV, or CBC. The Rebel did talk about it initially, but who else had the story on their front page? CNN? No. Fox News? No. The BBC did, over in the UK, had this as a front page story. So the story from the BBC has the headline, Canada forgets to mention Jewish people at Holocaust Memorial. It also mentions that the plaque has been removed and will be updated accordingly. The BBC also rightly states that 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust and that they were the primary group to be persecuted by the Nazis. The BBC mentions that the Conservative opposition and Conservative senators brought up the issue in Ottawa and highlights their tweets and reactions. Also included in the BBC article is a statement from Heritage Minister Melanie Joly stating that the plaque would be replaced with one that, quote, reflects the horrors experienced by the Jewish people. Here at the right side, we don't only watch one side of the story in Canada. We also pay attention to our sources and friends abroad who read news and bring us mentions of Canada in those foreign news publications, either for good or for bad. So next time someone mentions that the Canadian media is great and never skips a beat, remember this story, that the BBC had a story about Canada that none of the other media did in Canada, even though this was being talked about in government by both the Heritage Minister and members of the opposition.
It's quite amazing when you have to get your sources about Canada from outside of Canada, considering how
and
much
let alone
media
the
we
BBC
actually have here. Yeah,
across an ocean.
Yeah, the BBC, it's a news organization that generally focuses on a lot of different areas of the world. So for them to be focusing on Canada and to have that headline, Canada forgets to mention Jewish people at Holocaust Memorial,
on the front page.
It makes us look like idiots, really, when you think about it.
It does.
So it's really a travesty that they have to cover this and that we have to pick up on it from the BBC when our own media is really silent on the issue. Yeah. It's crazy.
I actually have a theory on that, and the theory goes is that conservative senators and conservative opposition members were talking about it, and the Rebel was also talking about it in Canada. And I don't know if the BBC got it from the Rebel or if they picked it up from the Conservatives in Canada, but my theory is that the Canadian media elected not to cover this because it was first being covered in Canada by you-know-who, the Rebel. So wouldn't that be utterly deplorable if that was the case?
Yeah, it's amazing how if they show favoritism on a story just because of where the source came from. Now, here at the right side, of course, we look at all different stories, whether we like them or not, whether we like the organizations or not, whether we like the story or not. We'd look at everything to make sure that we know that we're on the right side of the news.
That's right. We have no problem quoting the Rebel. We have no problem quoting CBC. We have no problem quoting the BBC, as long as they are stating facts and they're talking about what's actually going on, which is what is happening in this case. And the key point of this is that, no, it's not a kayak, or it's not a refugee, or it's not Omar Khadr. It's something that the media horribly missed, and a big miss at that, I think. To not even mention the word Jewish or Jew in a Holocaust dedication plaque, that's just downright deplorable. So. Well, we'll have to see if they clean up their act for next week. But in any case, that leads us nicely into our word of the week. And this is something we talked about a lot this week. And the word of the week is terrorism, which is defined as the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians in the pursuit of political aims. The fight against terrorism. And this goes back to our Alberta story, specifically relating to the Edmonton terrorist attack, and the key point here being the pursuit of political aims. And, the attacker, as we said, talked about genocide, and there was the ISIS flag in the car. And, most of these little things that, in effect, define this attack were, mentioned once in the media and then glossed over. I don't know if that's that they didn't want to use the terrorism word all that much, or if they felt as though because it's not an official investigation yet, we don't need to use the word terrorism. But nonetheless, this was terrorism, and it actually fits very well into this definition here of terrorism. So civilians, political aims, and violence and intimidation, of course. So that is our word of the week here at the Right Side: terrorism.
Don't really have anything to add to that. I think you covered it pretty well there.
All right. Well, with that being said, that wraps up this episode of The Right Side. Here's hoping that the news week doesn't start a couple hours after we publish this show, and we'll be back to a normal size and scope of The Right Side next week. But if you want more, you can find us at rightsidenews.ca. You can subscribe on iTunes at rightsidenews.ca/iTunes, or on YouTube at rightsidenews.ca/YouTube. And we're also on Twitter and Facebook at RightSideCA. With that being said, we'll see you next week for another episode of The Right Side. Thank you for sharing your time with us.
And we will always look at whatever source it is to determine the right side of the news for you. So with that, we will see you next week.